All right, now I would really want to introduce our keynote speaker for this week, a talented cyclist himself, aspiring TDF writer, Dr. Alan Berman, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives and Research, talking about a new approach for Black Hat workshops.
Yeah, and all of you, please type your questions into the chat. As Alan is presenting, and we'll do our best to get them answered.
Indeed. Over to you, Alan.
All right. Thanks a lot, AJ. Thanks, Chuck. All right. If somebody can pull up the slides, we can go ahead and get started. We'll start off with a quote. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. Who said that? I'm pretty sure none of us knows that. Don't get up. It was Helmut von Moltke in the 1800s. He was a Prussian field marshal. But really the message there was that, you can plan and plan, but until you get into battle, a lot of that strategy it becomes kind of a mental exercise and not much beyond that. I personally like the more contemporary quote from Mike Tyson. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. So let's go on to the first page here. Really, what is a black hat? So a black hat is a live simulation exercise where participants are going to form teams and develop a win strategy for the likely competitors. This is a wargaming learning exercise. And again, the reason for this is that you can do a lot of thinking and strategizing and coming up with all sorts of complex plans and great ideas. But until you actually get a chance to, test them in the field a little bit, it's really hard to do. And in war, you're not going to go off and start a war just to test new systems and tactics. So you'll do wargaming exercises. And in proposals and winning competitions, you can't really submit a preliminary proposal. How did I do? And then see if you can get some feedback before the actual competition. So what you'll do is you'll do these competitive wargaming exercises, and you try to learn as much as you can. So what are we learning within these black hat simulations? The outputs are really about giving the capture team a few sets of insights. One is, how are the competitors going to position themselves to win? How might they seek to undermine our win strategy? And how might an evaluator score different offerings? So in going through all that and with those learning objectives, how do we end up using those outputs? First, we're going to reassess our offering to ensure that it really creates differentiation and a unique customer value. So differentiation meaning, how are we different from competitors? Not just are we meeting the requirements, but are we meeting the requirements in a new and different way? And not just the kind of the vanilla requirements, but what are the key things that the customer is looking for in this competition? If it's a recompetition, what were issues with the previous round, the incumbent and how they were performing? If it's a program upgrade or if it's a new program, what were some of the issues with the previous platform that they're looking to solve? And so it's really about creating that unique customer value in a differentiated way. In addition, the outputs are going to help us develop ghosting approaches for the competitors' strengths and weaknesses. So if we think that through this exercise we identify a few competitors' strengths, what can we do in our proposal to maybe downplay or say, hey, we have that too, or we have a different version of it? Or how do we play on their weaknesses? So if there's a competitor that might have weaknesses around supply chain, maybe that's something that we want to talk about more detail, to talk about the strengths that we have there and really call out the value that that's going to create, so that way the customer, as they're evaluating the proposals, will see, hey, this company has that company doesn't. That really creates an important differentiation. And then finally, what we'll do for using the outputs is shaping the competition to really neutralize the competitors' advantages and accentuate their weaknesses. So when you're in the pre-RFP phase, you have the opportunity to still have interactions with the customer and try to shape the competition, try to get the evaluation criteria and the requirements formed in a certain way that really puts you at an advantage and tries to disadvantage the competitors. Let's go on to the next page then. So what's wrong with the traditional approach? In strategy development, open loop brainstorming can create interesting ideas, but One of the things that we've seen in kind of the original model of black hat analyses or black hat workshops was really, they were a lot less structured. And so the outputs ended up being kind of non-standardized. And it was a little bit difficult to compare the results of team A versus team B versus team C, just because each team tended to kind of go in a different direction. One might be focusing on the technical offering, one might be focusing on the team that was assembled and the enterprise strategy. And so you end up with unnecessarily narrow views of how competitors might act, and it doesn't end up being expansive enough to really consider the full strategy that the competitors might have. Then the other part of it is around this notion of open loop versus closed loop. So what is open loop and what's closed loop? Open loop is if you are baking a cake, you take the ingredients out, you mix them up in the bowl, you put it in the pan, you put it in the oven for 35 minutes at 350 degrees, you take it out and you serve the cake. And I hope those 35 minutes were enough, but you don't really know. Closed loop is maybe you bake it for 32 minutes or 33 minutes, take it out, stick the toothpick in, see if it's done or not, then put it back in for a few more minutes and then iterate. So that whole notion of doing a little bit of testing and getting some information before you finalize, that gives you an opportunity to make adjustments as necessary, and then you can end up with a better product. So if you don't do stress testing and you don't close the loop, the strategy typically has some key weaknesses and lacks robustness. And so while we'd like to think that our competitors are not going to have strong strategies, it's really a disservice to yourself to expect that your competitors are not going to have the best possible strategy. If you underestimate competitors, you do that at your own peril. So for our own clients, we use this making winning choices process to develop and stress test strategies. And so what we thought is, why aren't we doing that for competitors in a simulation, really allowing putting a best foot forward for competitors, so that way we don't run the risk of underestimating how competitors might be behaving. Let's go on to the next slide and we can talk a little bit more about the approach that we have. So this is the flow chart for making winning choices that we use for strategy development, and now we're starting to use it for black hat workshops as well. And making winning choices is really the structured process for developing and stress testing a strategy, and really selecting and refining that best winning approach. It starts off by really understanding what is the competitive challenge that you're working within, and we'll do this with customer and competitor analyses to really understand what's the situation that we're in, what's the competitive environment, and then based on that, we can start to develop strategic options. And the options that we create are really kind of open loop, meaning it's like, okay, well, I kind of have an idea of this is the situation, so I think the strategy can be this. And what we end up doing is, instead of just stopping there and say, hey, we have a strategy based on our understanding of the situation, what we'll do is we'll do this reverse engineering, we'll stress test. So what the reverse engineering does is, for that option that we've decided on or that we have as a hypothesized strategy, what has to be true for it to be a good idea? What has to be true for it to be successful? And then as we identify all these conditions, we start to see, okay, well, are some of these going to be problematic? Like, are some of these conditions maybe not going to be true? Or are some of these conditions unknown? Or are some of these conditions really important to the strategy, but maybe we have very little control over making that condition true? What we try to do is design tests to validate those conditions. We'll conduct some analysis, but ultimately what we want to get to is the step 7, where we select that strategic option that ends up being most robust. And this is in the case of having multiple options. In the case of having a single option that you stress test, what you'll do is you'll say, okay, well, of the conditions that I've come up with, which ones do I think are problematic for that strategy? And with that, are there changes or adjustments that I want to make to the strategy to make it a little bit more robust, or make it so that it'll satisfy some of these really important conditions? The other thing that the conditions lead you to is there are going to be a number of conditions that maybe aren't 100% true, or it's still kind of unknown if it's going to be true or not based on external situations. And so what you'll do is you'll create an action plan and define strategy metrics. So the action plan is, these are the imperatives for the capture team to make that strategy true, to satisfy those conditions as well as that we can. And then the strategy metrics are around, okay, well, let's keep monitoring those conditions. And if we see something go the wrong way, let's say maybe the customer says we had a certain assumption around one of the conditions around the customer, and then the customer goes in a very different direction, then that would cause us to go back and say, okay, well, maybe the strategy isn't as strong as we thought, and let's go back and iterate on the process. So that's the overall process that we use for strategy development. On the next page, we kind of focus in on the crux of it. It's really about starting at the end. You hypothesize a strategy, and then you go backwards and try to identify conditions of success. On the next page, I don't have to spend that much time on this page. There we go. How do we go about articulating what that win strategy is? So one of the things I mentioned early on is that you end up kind of in an unstructured black hat approach. You end up with each of the teams that are acting as one of the competitors will kind of have their own focus and their own direction in terms of how they articulate their strategy. And so one of the things that we find to be very important is really having a standard way of articulating the strategy across what we think are really the important dimensions in a proposal. It's the enterprise strategy, the technical offering, the program approach, and then the pricing and contract terms. All too often, companies will really focus on the technical approach. It's like all about the thing. It's going to go faster. It's going to be stealthier. It's going to be much higher performance in whatever dimension ends up being important. And those do end up being important. However, it's not the most important. And people who have been in and around proposals and really looked at section L and section M of the request for proposals, you see that, yeah, the technical ends up being important, but it's not 90% of the total evaluated score. It's not 90% points. The technical offering ends up being one of multiple factors that might end up being on order of 20-some% or 30-some% of the total score, or in the 40s. It's not really the most important thing, and it's a lot of other things end up being really important, and you can't underestimate them. So it's going to be important to have a good articulation of what the strategy would be across those other dimensions. So enterprise strategy is a really important one. So what are the resources that we're bringing to bear? Who are our teaming partners? What leadership do we have that's going to give confidence in being able to execute? What are the responsibilities of the prime and subs within the team, just so that there's a clear understanding of who's doing what and how the team that you've assembled is really the strongest team for executing the contract requirements. And then what are the facilities and manpower? Is this going to require new investment, or are these unproven teams, or is this resources that are have good experience as well as have capacity to be able to execute on the project? The technical offering, what's the approach for meeting the requirements? What are maybe some of the complementary services that are offered? So it's maybe not necessarily only about the, how fast does it fly, but what are we doing in the design that makes it sustainable and reliable, so that way which ends up being a really important performance characteristic for aircraft. It's the availability, not necessarily how fast does it go or how many pounds of payload does it carry. Part of the technical offering is the innovations that we bring. The technologies, are they mature? And then the program approach is also super important. What's our management approach and relative timing? Is this something that we're going to be able to deliver maybe faster than competitors, and that creates additional value for the customer? And how are we managing risk? How do we make sure that this doesn't go 50% over on schedule and 50% over on cost? Having a good, strong risk management story ends up giving the customer a lot of confidence. And then the pricing and contract terms, of course. So let's go on to the last page here, just looking at the clock and see we're running out of time. Our new process is very much around using this making winning choices reverse engineering structure. So in the course of a day, we'll send out a pre-read, which really has our competitive assessment and price to win outputs, and whatever client competitive intelligence materials there are, to really ground the participants in what the competitive environment is and what we know about the competitors. Then during the course of the day, what we'll do is we'll start off by talking about some of the customer priorities and the evaluation criteria, some of the competitor highlights, and then give instructions on how we're going to do this and do team assignments. And then what we'll do is we'll break out into teams. And the teams will have a mix of SMA individuals for facilitation and content contribution, as well as really mostly client individuals. And the teams are going to have to articulate the competitor's bid strategy across those 4 dimensions. They're going to have to stress test the strategy and then create their bid. So this refined strategy and their campaign approach, like how they might be doing shaping. And then we'll go back into a combined session. Each of the teams will present. We'll have some mock scoring for each of the proposals, and then we're really going to focus on takeaways. What are the competitors' weaknesses? What are the ghosting opportunities? What are the vulnerabilities of our own offering that we'd want to protect against? And what other insights are there from the exercise? And so again, this is all back to trying to close the loop, doing simulations to learn a little bit more about what the competition is really going to be like, because again, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. So, all right, let's leave it at that. This is something, the kind of a different approach, a newer approach that we're using for Black Hats, and I think it ends up being a lot more robust and more valuable for the capture team in terms of the outputs that it creates and the insights that it produces.
Thank you so much, Alan. And no one wants to be punched in the mouth. No. In one of our future sessions, we're going to have an interesting anecdote offered by Pete Weitzman around his own experience, not with Mike Tyson, but with the great Ali. So
right.
So I really want to emphasize this is a new offering we've started to introduce to the marketplace. It's taken us 40 years to get to the point of taking Black Hats, reducing it, changing it from an ad hoc process to a methodical, analytic-based process. I'm really excited about doing this, and I think our clients are going to really get a lot more out of their Black Hats. Right, Jock?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've already seen great results from what we've been doing. It's had a huge impact on the competitiveness of the clients that have embraced it. We also want to get this information out to all of our associates, so we'll put this up on the Learning Management Center. And of course, this presentation will be up on YouTube, as I said earlier.